there. So I hope you get a sense of kind of what anthropology was like in the old days of field work, but also how in some ways those methods have carried over into contemporary society and into our studies today, even if we are studying inside the United States. So I'd like to start with the on ethnographic methods section, this little module, module 3 here, because we get a sense of what it is that anthropologists actually do, at least cultural anthropologists in the field. And so on page 260, we get this first definition, which is simply that it's an extended period of close involvement with the people whose way of life interests an anthropologist. Classically, that might be for, as Bohannon did, as Laura Bohannon did in the 1950s and 60s, that would be for a year to go through a cycle of life with the people, maybe a year or 2 years. In today's world, you may spend different visits into the field. The field site might be closer, or you might be able to travel there more, but you should be able to spend enough time that you get a sense of people's life cycle and a little bit of their historical perspective as well. And so as we saw in the video and we read here, the method of field work that anthropologists use, we like to call participant observation, which is, it's not a very fancy thing, but it does mean a couple of things. It means that we should never be spies. The people should always know that we're doing a study, that there should be consent to being studied. So it should not be a covert operation. And the anthropologist shouldn't just be an observer. So they shouldn't just be sitting there observing things. But they want to participate as much as possible, but that doesn't mean you completely become a participant, that you're ever completely a part of the people you're studying. You always have to shuttle between, as we saw in the film, shuttle between the participation and the observation part. And a little bit later on, they talk about people living in the field and living in this urban neighborhood in which they tried to live with the same income or the same budget as some of the families they were living with. And in general, I would say that one of the most important parts about fieldwork, about participant observation, is trying to live through that experience in your own body. And I talked about the idea of cultural relativism as walking a mile in another person's shoes. And sometimes that is simply really important to live in that climate, to put on people's shoes, to try and understand how they navigate the world and to work with them. Again, you're not trying to in this popular stereotype of going native. You're never going to be that. That's not something that anthropologists try to do. You're trying to participate, observe, and interpret, and then bring back a story. Remember, your goal is an ethnography or a writing about people that you're going to share in some form. We just learned in the last chapter about the idea or the concept of culture. And in an ideal sense, fieldwork is going to go hand in hand with or reinforce some of the main points that we talked about in terms of what we think of as culture. So as we talked about in culture, culture is had two parts: that human life is patterned and that we learn those patterns. And so when we do field work, we are looking to find the patterns of human life in their own places, in their own terms, trying to understand people's point of view from their own perspective on things. And we also discover how those patterns are acquired, how people learn them, how that can vary over time, and how those patterns get transmitted from one generation to the next or shared among peers. We actually experience this because in some ways going to another place is almost like becoming a child in that place, in that you have to learn things from the beginning. And so there was an interesting part here. Actually, Francis, you brought it up, this idea of rich points. What do you get out of the rich points?
The areas where the anthropologists and the people that they were observing wouldn't understand. So like, I think I said like lost in translation. You only kind of understand if you live there or are there.
Okay, so you're going to come across places where there's, I mean, it's great when things are being understood. Everybody likes to be able to understand and explain to each other. But as anthropologist Michael Agar, who's kind of a very famous field worker, put it, there's these places where you have to kind of make some leaps and figure out what's going on and try to do more than what you may have been accustomed to. And I would say that it's at these places where this idea that people are determined by their biological race, and that determines their capacities. If you're doing field work in the right way, and you're exploring these points of agreement and disagreement, these rich points, the whole idea that people are determined by their biology or by their environment is not going to be supported by your field work. You're going to see too much variation, and you're going to be able to document how different people are, both across human groups, so one might consider cross-cultural difference, but also within any given group. And we talked in the last class about the danger of assuming that everyone within a particular culture, particular society is the same or homogeneous, because when you're in there, when you're in a group, whatever it is the group might be called, you're going to then discover that there is a lot of variation even within one society or within one group. So ideally, there's a complementarity between the idea of culture that anthropologists were putting out in the starting around in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and this field work that they also began to do in order to understand what was going on out there in the kind of laboratory of human beings. I consider fieldwork and anthropology to be a kind of exercise, not necessarily in objectivity, but in being extremely subjective and immersed in a place. Now, we often get weirded out by the idea of being subjective. We're told that we need to be objective, and we need to free ourselves of any biases. And don't get me wrong, we don't want to be biased. That's not a good thing. But the idea that we could be detached or completely outside of the human condition can't really work during fieldwork. So there's a couple things that I wanted to point out here. One is the idea of the dialectic. And the other, is the idea of reflexivity. So there's a couple things that come out here on page 268, where Lavenda and Schultz bring up these sort of pretty big words, the dialectic of fieldwork and the idea of reflexivity. And actually, Brooke, you talked a little bit about this. What happens in the anthropological encounter? What goes on? Okay, so there's this dialogue that you might say between the researcher and with the people being researched that changes both of them. And so the researcher realizes things about the other society, but also about themselves. And in the same way, by doing this, by asking people to reflect on their own society, it brings up, and we talked about how culture is done with some degree of human consciousness, but often not a lot. And so to actively reflect on this brings up to consciousness some of the things that you may have not thought about when you're kind of living out your life. All of a sudden, someone is there to sort of prod you into thinking and talking about things that you may not have thought about before. And so there's this, again, the idea of the dialectic is kind of like a dialogue between two parties, which results in a new synthesis. And it's also something I put here that is humanizing in the sense that if we remember, anthropology was born into a world that is still very hierarchically organized, where some people come from wealthy countries and wealthy places, and others are limited in other forms of life. And the idea of fieldwork is to draw out not the hierarchy of those relationships, but to draw out the humanity of the people that are being studied, if there is a kind of hierarchical or unequal relationship between them. And so it's something that when you go to the field, whatever you may have thought of the people who live in that place, you're suddenly completely dependent on them for your own survival. And they're the experts and you're the dummy. They're the teachers and you're the student. It completely inverts the usual relationship between what we might say is we often establish in the classroom, between the people who are supposed to hold the knowledge and the people who are supposed to receive the knowledge. In anthropology, we leave the classroom in order to go to places and to receive knowledge, or to speak with people who then become in some way our own teachers. And so hopefully that helps to humanize a relationship that is often quite hierarchical. And so Lavenda and Schultz end this section with a rather, again, a kind of a strange phrasing here. They talk about that anthropological knowledge is open-ended in the sense that it's ever changing and evolving as societies and people themselves change and proliferate. And they have this idea that we can never escape from our humanity to some point of view that would allow us to see human existence and human experience from the outside. And so for me, and I think that's what Lavenda and Schultz are saying, is that the point of anthropology is not necessarily to achieve some kind of outside of the world experience in which you have become an unbiased person. Again, we don't want to become a biased person, but to use that experience to deeply understand your own biases and the biases of others as well, perhaps even the people you're working with. And so, this is hopefully, it seems like, at least from your comments, it seems like the module was perhaps more interesting to you than I imagined it would be.